The Texas sun was beginning to sink behind the dusty hills, casting long, golden shadows over the small-town auction yard. The air was thick with the smell of worn leather, dry earth, and anticipation. Tess Morgan stood quietly at the edge of the corral, her fingers nervously brushing the folded bidding card in her hand. She hadn't planned to stay long. She only came out of curiosity, just to watch. But something had changed the moment she saw the horse. A tall chestnut gelding stood alone in the pen, his ears forward, his eyes calm. There was a strange stillness about him, a quiet that felt almost familiar. Tess couldn't explain it, but the moment she laid eyes on him, her heart tugged hard. Then the auctioneer's voice rang out, slow and weathered, "Lot number 41. No name, no reserve. Left behind by a rancher who disappeared last year. Horses in good health. Real gentle." Tess froze. Her eyes dropped to the small tag hanging from the saddle. It was old and worn, and someone had handwritten a message on it, "To Tess, father's last gift." Her breath caught. Her father, Daniel Morgan, had vanished 13 months ago. No goodbye, no sign, just gone. Law enforcement gave up. Everyone gave up. But not Tess. She never believed he left without a reason. And now, this. She stepped closer to the pen, barely aware of the people watching her. The horse didn't shy away. His eyes met hers, calm and steady. A memory washed over her, her dad in the barn, brushing down a horse, saying, "You can always tell a man's soul by the horse he leaves behind." Her hand reached out on instinct. The gelding leaned into her touch like he already knew her. "Do we have a bidder?" the auctioneer called. Tess raised her hand without speaking. "Opening at 100. No one else moved. After a pause, the auctioneer nodded. "Sold." The gavel hit the wood. Just like that, it was hers. Tess led the horse out slowly, the small crowd parting in silence. A few older cowboys tipped their hats respectfully. No one said a word, but she could feel it. Something had shifted. The paper tag fluttered again in the breeze, and she gripped it tighter. "To Tess, father's last gift." Who wrote it? Why now? Was it really from him? She didn't have the answers. But as she looked into the horse's steady eyes again, she knew one thing. This wasn't just a coincidence. Her father had left her something. Maybe a message. Maybe a trail. Whatever it was, it had just begun. The drive back to the ranch was quiet. Tess kept glancing at the horse in the trailer through her rearview mirror, as if expecting him to disappear. Every bump in the road, every gust of wind, made her grip the steering wheel a little tighter. She couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play, like she had just stepped into a story her father had started writing before he vanished. Her heart ached with questions, but there was something else, too. A strange peace. For the first time in over a year, she felt like her father was nearby. Back at the ranch, the familiar creak of the old barn welcomed her. The place still smelled like him. Saddle soap, hay, and coffee. Tess led the gelding inside, whispering softly as she tied him to the post. He stood calm, like he'd always belonged there. That same note still hung from the bridle, but as she unbuckled it, she noticed something else, an old, cracked leather saddlebag, fastened tightly behind the saddle. Her stomach turned. With careful fingers, she unlatched the buckles. Inside, there were only a few items: a faded flannel shirt, a small silver key, and a folded map. The shirt was unmistakable, blue plaid, elbow patches worn from years of use. Her dad's favorite. She brought it to her face and breathed it in. It still smelled like him. Her throat tightened. This wasn't just someone's abandoned horse. This was planned. She unfolded the map slowly. It was an old county survey, marked in pencil with a small X deep in the hills west of town, near the canyon trail they used to ride together. Next to the mark, scribbled in her father's unmistakable handwriting, were 3 words: "Trust the trail." She stared at it, her fingers trembling. Her father had left her a path. A real one. But why this way? Why through a horse and a saddlebag, instead of just calling or writing a letter? The questions grew heavier, but Tess could feel the urgency. Whatever her father had hidden, he didn't want just anyone to find it. He wanted her to. And now, she had the first clue. She folded the map carefully and placed it on the shelf, next to the key and the shirt. As the sun dipped behind the barn, casting the last warm light through the cracks in the wood, Tess turned back to the gelding. He stood there, watching her with those same steady eyes. She stepped forward and laid a hand gently on his neck. "What did he tell you?" she whispered. The horse didn't move, but somehow, Tess felt like the journey was only just beginning. Tess woke before sunrise the next morning, the map still on her nightstand and the silver key resting beside it. She hadn't slept much. Her thoughts circled endlessly. Her father's disappearance, the note, the trail marked on the map. The weight of it all had shifted something inside her. For over a year, she had lived in a kind of fog, half existing. But now, for the first time since he vanished, she had direction. And it was scrawled in her father's handwriting. "Trust the trail." She saddled the gelding just as the sky began to lighten with soft gold and blue. The old bridle fit perfectly, as if he'd worn it many times before. She still hadn't chosen a name for him. It didn't feel right yet. Not until she knew the whole story. As they left the ranch, the morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of cedar and dust. The gelding moved with confidence beneath her, as though he remembered the path before she even guided him toward it. The trail to Canyon Ridge was steep and quiet, weaving through thick mesquite and stretches of tall, swaying grass. Tess kept the map tucked inside her jacket, glancing down at it every so often. The X was deep in the hills, near an old overlook they used to ride to when she was a teenager. It had been her father's favorite spot, a place he called the edge of the world. She hadn't been there since the week before he disappeared. As the sun rose higher, painting the canyon in warm amber light, Tess felt a strange calm settle over her. The ride should have been exhausting, but instead it felt familiar, like muscle memory. And the horse never faltered, not once. Every turn, every dip in the path, he handled with ease. It was as if he'd made the journey before. Maybe he had. Maybe with her father. That thought sent a shiver down her spine. Just past a bend in the trail, she spotted it, an old fence post, nearly hidden by overgrowth, with a rusted horseshoe nailed to the top. She pulled the map out again. The mark was just ahead. Her heart pounded as she dismounted and tied the reins loosely to a tree. The air was quiet, the only sound the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. She stepped carefully toward a cluster of large rocks, half covered in moss and dry grass. And then she saw it, wedged between the stones, hidden but placed with care. A small, rusted lockbox. Her breath caught. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver key. It was time to find out what her father had left behind. The lock clicked open with a soft snap, but to Tess, it echoed like thunder in the silence of the canyon. Her fingers hesitated on the lid, her pulse pounding in her ears. For a moment, she didn't want to open it. Because once she did, she knew whatever was inside could change everything. There would be no going back. With a breath that shook in her chest, she lifted the lid. Inside was a single envelope, yellowed around the edges, edges curled from time and dust. Her name was written on the front in the familiar looping script she hadn't seen in over a year. Tess. Nothing else. No date. No return address. Just her name. Her eyes burned. She ran her thumb slowly across the ink before carefully breaking the seal. The letter was handwritten. Every line was filled with her father's voice, calm, honest, and a little rough, just like she remembered. He wrote about the fear that had crept into his life, how he had stumbled into something dangerous he couldn't fully explain. He mentioned a man from out of state who had been pressuring him for land, threatening the ranch and everything tied to it. Tess's chest tightened. Her father had kept all of it from her, to protect her, to carry the weight alone. "If you're reading this," he wrote, "then it means I had to disappear. Not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. I couldn't drag you into it, Tess. You deserved to live without looking over your shoulder." Tears welled in her eyes, but she kept reading. The letter went on to describe the horse, how he had trained him quietly over months, preparing him in case Tess ever needed to follow the trail he couldn't finish. He called the horse Ranger. Said he named him that because he always stayed close, always knew the way home. "I left Ranger with the only people I trusted. If he found his way to you, it means someone kept their promise." Tess folded the letter slowly, her hands trembling. The truth weighed heavy, but it wasn't just fear. It was love. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had protected her the only way he knew how. She stood up, holding the letter close to her chest. The canyon around her was still, but she felt something shift, like a door in her heart had finally opened. Tess walked back to the gelding, who watched her quietly, as if waiting. She ran her fingers through his mane. "Ranger," she said softly. "So that's your name." And in that moment, for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so lost. Tess drove into town the next morning with Ranger in the trailer and the letter tucked safely in her glove compartment. The weight of her father's words still echoed in her chest. "I couldn't drag you into it," but now she was in it, deep. And if someone had truly helped her father hide the horse, then maybe they knew more. She needed to find out who had brought Ranger to that auction. It was the only lead she had. She stopped at the old feed store off Highway 18. The place hadn't changed in decades. Same faded sign, same creaky screen door, same familiar faces behind the counter. As she stepped inside, the bell above the door rang with a tired jingle. A few ranchers nodded her way, but one man turned sharply at the sound, gray-bearded, tall, and lean. Hank Rollins, her father's longtime friend and former ranch hand. "Tess," he said, surprised. "Ain't seen you in a while." His eyes flicked toward the window, where the horse trailer was parked. "That your new purchase from the auction yesterday?" She nodded, studying him carefully. "Yeah. Chestnut gelding. Tag said he was left behind after a disappearance." She paused. "Funny thing is, it had my name on it." Hank's expression changed, barely, but Tess saw it. A flicker of recognition. Guilt? Or something else? He looked down at the counter, then back up. "Where'd you hear that?" The note was tied to his bridle. Said, "To Tess, father's last gift." She pulled the letter from her jacket and placed it gently on the counter. "You knew, didn't you?" For a long moment, Hank said nothing. He looked at the letter like it was a ghost. Then he sighed and rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Your dad didn't want you involved, Tess. But I guess he knew you'd find him one way or another." His voice was low now. "Yeah, I kept the horse. He asked me to. Said someday you might come lookin'. I brought Ranger to the auction 2 weeks ago. Left the note. Figured, if the time was right you'd know." Tessa's heart pounded. Why now? Why bring him out after all this time? Hank's eyes met hers, somber, steady. "Because I think your dad's in trouble. Real trouble. And if he ain't back by now, it's not because he doesn't want to be." A silence fell between them, thick with history. Tess folded the letter again, her hands steadier now. She didn't have all the answers, but she had a direction. And maybe, just maybe, a reason to hope. The drive back from town felt heavier this time. Tess couldn't stop replaying Hank's words in her mind. If he ain't back by now, it's not because he doesn't want to be. It was the first time someone besides her had admitted that her father might still be alive, and also in danger. The confirmation shook something loose inside her. She had lived in quiet grief for over a year, but now that pain was transforming into purpose. Back at the ranch, Tess unsaddled Ranger and let him graze in the paddock. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he too sensed that something had shifted. She went into the house, poured herself a cup of black coffee, and laid the map on the kitchen table again. Her eyes scanned every inch of it, searching for something she had missed. Then, she noticed it, light pencil markings near the bottom corner, almost invisible. Coordinates. And next to them, the faint outline of a name, Red Hollow. She knew that place. Or at least, she thought she did. Red Hollow was the name of an old mine, abandoned decades ago after a cave-in. Her father had taken her hiking there once when she was 14. She remembered the way he'd spoken about it, not just as a piece of history, but as if it held secrets. She recalled how serious he got when she asked too many questions. Some places keep their own stories buried, he'd told her. Tess sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Could that be where he was hiding? Or where he had gone to meet someone, and never returned? The possibilities chilled her. But she also remembered the key. She retrieved it from the shelf, turning it over in her hand. It was simple, small, the kind that might open a padlock. A mine entrance, maybe? A supply shed? The questions only deepened the mystery. She made a list: flashlight, rope, map, water, ranger's tack. She'd leave before sunrise. She wasn't foolish enough to go wandering around an abandoned mine in the dark. But she also wasn't going to wait anymore. If her father had left her this trail, he had done so with intention. And whatever Red Hollow meant, it was the next step. As she packed her bag, she looked out the window at the open field stretching beyond the barn. The wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was chasing a ghost. She was following a path. One her father had left, one only she was meant to find. Tess left the ranch before dawn, the sky still clinging to darkness as Ranger trotted along the dirt road. The air was cool and quiet, filled with the low hum of crickets and the soft creak of saddle leather. She followed the old trail west, past rusted fences and dried creek beds, just as the sun began to peek over the horizon. With the map tucked securely in her jacket and the silver key tied to a leather string around her neck, Tess felt a growing sense of urgency, like each step was pulling her closer to something she wasn't quite ready for. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the foothills where Red Hollow was marked on the map. The land grew wilder out there, less traveled, overgrown, and strangely still. Tess dismounted near a half-buried sign, its paint long faded, but the words just barely readable: Red Hollow Mining Company. EST 1912. The entrance to the mine sat farther up the ridge, tucked behind tall grass and broken stones. Time had done its damage. The wooden support beams were cracked, and debris littered the path. But something about the way the area was cleared, just enough to walk through, made her believe someone had been there not long ago. She tied Ranger to a tree near the entrance and took out her flashlight. As she stepped into the dark mouth of the mine, the temperature dropped sharply. Her breath formed faint clouds in front of her face. The narrow corridor opened into a small chamber lined with wooden crates and rusted tools. It looked untouched for decades, until she saw it. A lantern. Modern. Clean. Placed deliberately on a crate next to an empty thermos and a folded tarp. Someone had been here. Her pulse quickened. She moved deeper into the mine, past collapsed timbers and loose gravel, until she reached a small locked gate wedged into the rock. It was out of place, sturdy, newer than the rest. She pulled the silver key from around her neck, her fingers cold and shaking, and slid it into the lock. A soft click echoed through the chamber. The gate creaked open. Behind it was a narrow tunnel, and at the far end, faint light flickered, like a candle or lantern just out of sight. Tess froze. Part of her wanted to call out. Part of her didn't dare. What if it wasn't her father? What if it was someone else? She stepped forward slowly, the echo of her boots bouncing off the stone walls. Every nerve in her body was alive, bracing for what she might find. With each step, the light grew stronger, and so did the feeling that whatever waited at the end of that tunnel would change everything. Tess stepped carefully through the narrow passage, the rocky floor uneven beneath her boots. The flickering light ahead cast long, shifting shadows on the stone walls, and each echo of her footfalls sounded louder than the last. She clutched the flashlight tighter, her breath shallow. Her heart thudded against her ribs, not just from fear, but from hope. After all the questions, all the silence, someone was waiting at the end of this tunnel, and it felt impossibly close now. As she rounded the final bend, the narrow corridor opened into a small chamber carved deep into the earth. A lantern sat on a ledge, illuminating the space with a warm, golden glow. There was a cot in the corner, a stack of canned food beside it, a journal, and a duffel bag. The room wasn't abandoned. It was lived in, recently. Her eyes scanned the space, and then she saw him. A man stood near the far wall, his back to her. Tall, shoulders slightly slumped. He turned slowly at the sound of her steps. For a second, Tess couldn't breathe. The beard was longer, his face thinner. But those eyes, clear, steady, familiar, were unmistakable. "Dad," she whispered. Daniel Morgan didn't speak at first. His eyes filled with tears as he stepped forward. "Tess, I didn't think you'd find me." His voice cracked, heavy with exhaustion and guilt. She didn't know whether to cry or scream. Instead, she threw her arms around him, holding him like a memory she thought was lost. His arms wrapped around her carefully, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Time stood still in that moment, the weight of everything unspoken pressing into the silence between them. After a long pause, they sat near the lantern, and he began to speak. He told her everything. About the man who tried to force him into selling the land. About the threats, the warnings. About how he staged his disappearance with Hank's help to protect her from what he feared was coming. "They were watching the ranch," he said. "If I stayed, they would have used you to get to me." Tess listened, stunned. She wanted to be angry. He had vanished, left her alone with grief and questions. But hearing the truth, seeing the pain in his eyes, softened the space where the anger had grown. It didn't make it right, but it made it real. She looked at him, voice trembling. "You're coming home with me." Daniel hesitated. "There's more you need to know. And it's not over yet." And just like that, Tess realized the reunion was only the beginning of something much bigger and far more dangerous. The mine chamber was quiet, but Tess could feel the tension building in her father's voice as he unzipped the old duffel bag by his side. He pulled out a thick folder, weathered but still intact, and handed it to her with careful hands. "Everything's in here," he said. "Names, contracts, bank transfers. I kept copies of everything they sent me. They wanted the land because of what's under it, minerals, maybe oil. I still don't know the full truth. But I knew enough to be a threat." Tess opened the folder and scanned the papers. There were maps with survey lines drawn over her family's property, letters signed with false names, and photos of unfamiliar men standing near the ranch fence line. The more she read, the colder her blood ran. This wasn't just a land dispute. It was organized, methodical, and dangerous. Her father hadn't just gone into hiding. He had buried himself alive to keep them both safe. "They gave me a deadline," Daniel continued. "Either sell or disappear. I chose the second option. But now, someone's been circling the ranch again. That's why I sent Ranger to find you. I needed you to be ready." Tess's mind raced. Everything she had known about the past year had just unraveled. The sleepless nights, the silence, the feeling that something was unfinished, it had all been real. She looked at him, her voice low but steady. "So what happens now?" "We go to the police." Daniel shook his head. "They tried. Local law enforcement backed off fast. Too many of them are in someone's pocket. I had one good contact in Dallas, but I lost touch with him months ago. That's why I stayed off-grid. I didn't want to lead them to you." She stood, pacing the edges of the small room, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. Ranger would be waiting outside. The ranch was no longer just a home, it was a target. She had inherited more than just land and memories. She had inherited a fight. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She knew what was worth protecting. "We'll go back," Tess said. "We'll find someone outside of town. Someone who'll listen. We get these files in the right hands, and we end this." Her eyes met his, firm and unwavering. "No more running." Daniel nodded slowly. "But we have to be careful. If they know I'm alive." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Tess already knew. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees swayed like watchers in the dark, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of an engine rumbled, low and steady, approaching from the east. Tess pressed her back against the mine wall, heart pounding as the sound of tires crunching gravel grew louder outside. Ranger let out a sharp snort, and she knew they didn't have much time. Her father moved quickly, gathering the documents, shoving them back into the duffel bag with practiced urgency. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Everything between them had already been said. Now it was about survival. Through a narrow crack in the mine entrance, Tess saw the black SUV roll to a stop. Two men stepped out. Not locals. She could tell by their posture, casual but alert. One held a walkie. The other scanned the trees. They weren't there to ask questions. They were there to make sure Daniel Morgan never resurfaced. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at her father. He nodded toward the back tunnel. "There's another exit. Not easy, but it's there." They moved fast. The tunnel was tight and half-collapsed, forcing them to crawl through sections choked with roots and loose dirt. Tess scraped her knee, felt blood trickle, but she didn't stop. She could hear footsteps echoing behind them now. Someone had entered the mine. But the light from the far end of the tunnel grew closer, until suddenly they burst out into the open, behind a cluster of mesquite trees at the base of the ridge. Ranger was there, still tied, ears pricked toward the noise. Tess jumped into the saddle without thinking, pulling her father up behind her. With one hard kick, Ranger bolted forward, muscles coiled with purpose. Bullets cracked through the trees, 2, maybe 3, but missed. The wind roared in her ears as they tore across the dry field, hooves pounding like thunder. Tess didn't look back. Not this time. She had everything she needed, and nothing she was willing to lose. They rode for nearly an hour before stopping on a back road near a rest area, far from town. There, hidden in an old payphone booth, her father made the call. The Dallas contact picked up. An old federal agent, retired but trusted. Daniel gave him a name, a time, and promised to deliver everything. Tess watched him from a distance, his hand trembling slightly on the receiver. For the first time, she saw not just the weight he carried, but the hope. A week later, the men were arrested. Federal charges. Land fraud, conspiracy, intimidation. It was all over the news. But Tess didn't care about headlines. She was home, her father beside her, the ranch safe, and Ranger grazing under the wide Texas sky. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried forever. Sometimes the trail leads you back to everything you thought you lost.